Mr. Benson, are we ready? Being 5:30? Oh, you can keep whispering. Sidebar. Quorum being present, I'm going to call the meeting to order for the June 17th, 2009 meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Creek Restoration and Water Quality Improvement Advisory Committee. I'd like to ask the clerk to call the roll.
Chair Moldaver.
Here.
Mr. Jordan.
Here.
Mr. Schluter.
Here.
Mr. Weber.
Here.
Mr. Wilson is here. And Mr. Hockman. And Mr. Jostes and Ms. Falcone are not here.
Thank you very much. That brings us to item number 3, consideration of the draft minutes from the May 13th meeting, which is in your packet as attachment 1. Is there a motion to approve or amend the minutes? Mr. Wilson, do you have a motion to make?
Well, I have a request for a minor amendment of the minutes, and then I would make a motion to approve. And in the item regarding the beach grooming, the discussion, there was 2 comments that I made, and one of them was just questioning the appropriateness, or should I say the legality in regards to the Brown Act of bringing the discussion forth how it was, and that didn't show up in the minutes. Sort of a minor point, but just sort of for clarity for the records, I would request if that could make it back in the minutes.
And with that amendment?
With that amendment, I would like to make a motion to approve the minutes, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a second? Second. Are there any other additions or corrections or amendments to the draft minutes from the May 13th meeting? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Are there any abstentions? Mr. Jordan abstains. So the minutes are accepted 4-0-1. That brings us to item number 5, adjustments to the agenda. Mr. Benson? Or
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have one adjustment to the agenda tonight. I wonder if the committee would be interested in appointing a member of the committee to serve as a liaison on the Upper Las Positas Creek Restoration Stormwater Management Project stakeholder group that we're putting together. These are interested individuals from the golf course community, and also for people who have a specific interest in water quality. The meetings are going to begin on June 23rd, 2 o'clock in this meeting room, which is next Tuesday, and they will be every other week through the construction of the project. And Mr. Chair, I think you have the authority to appoint any member of the committee who might be interested. Of course, all committee members are invited, as is the public, to attend those. There will be updates from all of the project staff as to what's going on with the project, and I just want to give you an opportunity to appoint someone before this first meeting.
Would it be someone interested and well qualified, like our former chair, Mr. Jordan, if he's willing and able to serve? Someone with a passing knowledge of both the recreational area and the creek watershed?
Handicaps notwithstanding. Yeah, I'd be, if nobody else is really chomping to get on the bid, I'd be happy to participate in that.
Yeah, thank you. And does anyone want to serve as Michael's alternate? Roger?
I was going to just suggest Daniel fill that role, since he seems to be familiar with the contractor, if he was willing. But I don't feel strongly about either one.
Oh.
That is against.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't see actually how the knowledge would help much, but more than happy to be an alternate to Mr. Jordan.
Okay, thank you. Do we need to make that as a motion, or should we just have it understood in the record?
I think you can just appoint someone to that position and the alternate as well. And,
All right, so if there are no objections, I'd like to appoint Michael Jordan to be the liaison to that work group, and Daniel Wilson to be his alternate.
Great. And once again, the first meeting will be Tuesday, June 23rd, 2 p.m. in the David Gebhardt Public Meeting Room. Thanks.
Anything else in terms of adjustments or alterations to the agenda? Okay, that brings us to item number 5, public comment. If there's any member of the public present who'd like to share their views on any subject not already listed on today's agenda, I'd like to ask them to come forward and identify themselves and be heard. There seems to be no response, so that would bring us to item number 6, committee member and staff communications. Mr. Benson, anything to report?
No.
I see Mr. Hockman, our liaison to Parks and Rec, is here, and do he or any of the other committee members have any meetings or communications to report? Well, that brings us to item number 7, the manager's report, attachment 2. Mr. Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have just a couple of items I wanted to report to you about. First is some of the events that the Creeks Division's been involved with recently. We participated in a World Ocean Day event on Saturday, June 6th over at the Ty Warner Sea Center out on Stearns Wharf. It was a very successful event. They estimated that they had somewhere around 400 people come out that day, and we were out there tabling and providing information about creek and ocean water quality and restoration projects that we're working on. This past Monday evening, we had a marine debris forum with Dr. Marcus Erickson and Anna Cummins from the Algalita Marine Research Foundation. We had an excellent turnout over at the Cabrillo Pavilion, about 65 or so people. Mr. Jordan was there, and we appreciated him coming out and representing the committee. And then coming up this weekend on Saturday, June 20th, we will be tabling over in Alameda Park as part of the Solstice Parade and celebration. And that's the first time we've set up a table for that event, and so we're looking forward to that. This year's theme happens to be Splash, so it's kind of appropriate to jump in and be part of that event. I also wanted to let the committee know about our participation in a couple of regulatory processes that are underway at the Regional Water Quality Control Board. These are two processes that are part of the Federal Clean Water Act. The first one is a triennial review of the Central Coast Region Basin Plan, and the second one is a proposed 2008 list of impaired water bodies on the Central Coast. And as part of those update processes, the board requests public comment from interested individuals because these have a direct impact on the city of Santa Barbara. The city's an interested individual, and the Creeks Division submitted comments on behalf of the city for in both processes. With regard to the Basin Plan update, our comments were particularly focused on the total maximum daily load regulatory process and the process the board would use as it develops what are called TMDLs, and particularly for bacteria, which they're looking at for Santa Barbara and really the whole South Coast. And second, with regard to the Section 303D listings, these Section 303D of the Federal Clean Water Act requires the states to periodically prepare and submit a list of impaired waters to the U.S. EPA. And basically, impaired waters are those that don't meet water quality standards. And then that list is used for further water-related regulatory, water-related regulation. And with regard to that proposed list, we submitted a comment letter that addressed very broad policy considerations, but also particulars of proposed listings and delistings. And I've attached both letters to my report for you to see the detail. And lastly, with regard to those, Creeks Division staff will be going to a July 10th Regional Water Board meeting to provide additional comment in person. And then lastly, I just wanted to give you an update. We just talked about the Upper Las Positas Creek project at our last committee meeting. The committee made a recommendation to council to authorize proceeding with that project, and on June 2nd, council that was on the June 2nd council agenda, and council approved moving forward with the project. We're finalizing everything with the contractor, and we expect to break ground on June 29th. So we're about a week away now. Yeah, after a long planning and design process. So we're really looking forward to getting that going, and we'll keep you updated as we move forward with that. And that's it.
Thank you. Excellent report. For people in the community who are interested, are summaries of your comments for the triennial and for the other thing going to be posted or linked at our website?
Both letters are online with the committee packet right now, and that's probably the easiest place to go. If anybody has problems, they can always call us at 897-2658, and we will direct them to it or email a copy to them.
I don't anticipate problems, but they might be so excited they might have suggestions. Okay, are there any questions on Mr. Benson's report? Mr. Schluter?
Can you define, just in general terms, what the Central Coast Region Basin encompasses?
You mean in terms of an area?
Geographical extent.
Oh gosh, it's most of Monterey.
It goes all the way up to Aptos and SoCal, but not all the way into the heart of Santa Cruz, I believe.
So the northern boundary is just south of Santa Cruz. Includes Monterey County, Monterey County, most of San Luis County, and Santa Barbara County, and then on the inland side, I can't remember how far.
But that's the coastal extent was one.
It's essentially southern Santa Barbara County up to Santa Cruz.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions on Mr. Benson's report? Hearing none, that brings us to item number 8, subcommittee reports. Are there any reports? Have any of the subcommittees met since the last meeting? All right. Daniel? Okay, let's... Is it okay? Go for it.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. I just wanted to make a brief comment that I've been hearing many of the Creeks Division and city-sponsored radio advertising about clean water and restoration and education and the like throughout the airwaves, and they're really excellent quality advertisements, whatever they are. I'm not a TV person, so I missed that whole segment of the media outreach campaign, and the recent radio slots have been well placed and well read. So I just 2 thumbs up on that. Thanks for continuing that.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. That brings us to item number 9, the 2 business items. The first one is the Laguna Watershed Study and Water Quality Improvement Feasibility Analysis. And Jill Murray will present on that one. Jill?
No, okay. What's the pointer? Oh, okay. But what about okay. Good evening, committee members. I'm going to update you on the Laguna Watershed Study and Water Quality Improvement Feasibility Analysis. Laguna Watershed was our, just one sec here. Oh, okay.
Laguna watershed is the watershed we've known the least about the last couple of years. So we undertook a study. The rationale was largely to try and address beach warnings at East Beach. East Beach at Mission Creek has had a high frequency of warnings over the summers, and both Mission Creek and Laguna Channel come out and merge in Mission Lagoon prior to discharge at the beach. And we've done many years of sampling, and we know that there are high levels of indicator bacteria in Laguna Channel. What wasn't known is where is the water coming from in Laguna Channel during low flow? What are the sources of contamination? We have the high indicator bacteria. Is that associated with any sources of human waste? And so therefore, what is the real risk to swimming from this discharge? And we wanted to develop a water quality improvement strategy for the watershed. Here's an aerial photo just showing you how the Mission Creek and Laguna Channel merge prior to discharge. The samples collected for the beach warnings are taken by the county just east of the discharge points. And Laguna Channel, the channel and the lower watershed is really low elevation. So during high tides, the channel itself and then basically ocean water would go right up the channel and flood the area. So these tide gates are put in. So if you're walking on Cabrillo, you can look down and see the concrete channel and that little house and some equipment and the tide gates. The tide gates are there unless it's a really big storm and the tide is low enough, then the tide gates will be opened. Otherwise, the tide gates are shut and all the flow is pumped around the gates. So it's a highly engineered system in a highly urban area. This is an outline of the watershed as we understood it when we started the project. The yellow line shows the outline, and this was based on digital elevations with about 2,000 acres in the watershed and mostly urban. And then during the study, doing field reconnaissance and really careful scrutiny of our storm drain atlas that shows and our GIS system, really getting it out and pouring through it over and over, we have decided that this is the outline of the watershed. The green is the outline of the watershed during low flow and most storms. So it's gone down to about 600 acres and now really entirely urbanized and almost entirely within a storm drain network. The open channel section at the bottom is quite short. The project funding for the study is mostly paid for through a Clean Beaches Initiative Proposition 50 grant, and that pays for the watershed study that will be presented here. And then the total project cost, almost $300,000, includes this study and then environmental review and up through preliminary design. The subcontracts, the last time you heard about this project was when you were recommending that we move forward with go to council for award of contracts to UCSB for the microbial source tracking portion of the study and Geosyntec for the dry weather hydrology and feasibility analysis. And so the study itself had two main components and then the feasibility analysis. So the study part had dry weather hydrology. The consultant put automated flow gauges inside the storm drain, down in the storm drain, and we took readings every 5 minutes for 2 weeks at 3 key locations. So we really got an understanding of the variability of flow. And we've learned from our previous projects that this is really important when you go and take spot measurements. Even if you take a lot of spot measurements, you can really miss a lot. And then the source tracking component was with UCSB, Dr. Trish Holden's lab. They took samples for our traditional fecal indicator bacteria tests and also 2 different DNA-based techniques. And the DNA test for bacteria that are very specifically living inside of human intestines. It might be a species of bacteria that can live in many different animals, like the indicator bacteria can, but then they have a DNA probe that can pull out just the signal of just the bacteria that are associated with humans and then therefore human waste. This is a map of our sample sites. You have a map that you have the same figure, but it actually has the site numbers. So we tried to delineate the watershed into the lower watershed into the main trunks of the storm drain network, and then several sites in the lower watershed. And this is actually a good one to just get oriented. So you can see 101 cutting across, and it's all storm drain up above that. And the creek becomes an open channel just below the 101 and then goes down to Chase Palm Park, or by Alistero, Chase Palm Park, then under Cabrillo, and then it's concrete again until through the pump station. So very briefly, there's a lot more information in your handout and in the report, which is online. the pictures show the flow gauge inside one of the storm drains, and then that's the equipment that logs the flow. And you can also see on the bottom that's there's a lot of sediment material in a lot of these drains. Approximately 100 gallons per minute is discharged from the lagoon, from the channel during low flow. And for scale, that's pretty similar to a little bit less, but on the same order of Mission Creek during low flow, when you're not getting anything through the concrete channel and pretty much everything is coming out of Old Mission Creek and down into the lower Mission Creek. Based on the patterns with the flow measurements, that wells and sumps are the major sources, and there's also seepage of groundwater into the storm drains. And there was a lot of variability during the day with some really interesting patterns. Some came, some went, and some were intractable. Really interesting to see. It was very helpful to have the continuous measurements. For the microbial source tracking, there was widespread and consistent identification of signal of the human waste marker, and we were really disappointed to see that. And it doesn't correlate with the levels of the indicator bacteria. That's consistent with other studies that UCSB has done and other groups have done. So there are spots with really high indicator bacteria that might come from some rotting plant material not associated with human waste, and there are some spots where we have consistent signal of the human waste and very relatively low indicator bacteria. We haven't identified the physical sources of this contamination, and the study wasn't designed to. It was designed to confirm the presence and quantify and locate it. The results, as I'll describe, do warrant some additional testing. So here's a visual of some of those results. Those are the same sampling sites, and the degree of shading is a very crude concentration. So it's a mixture of concentration and consistency from day to day, and with the two different methods. So you can see we really found when it was coming out from below the freeway. So it's all closed up above that. You can't really go up there and camp on the sides or anything like that. We found the sign consistently, and there downstream. We also found it in the main arm on Laguna, the main arm on Gutierrez, and then up Salsa Puedes, and up to basically the bottom of Ortega Park. And we weren't able to sample above there because our site was dry. So Geosyntech took these results and then took these results and looking at experiences other communities have gained and our own community has gained from our dry weather diversions and our ultraviolet disinfection project, did a cost-benefit analysis looking at many factors, including total project cost, the lifetime maintenance costs. We've learned a lot about these, power consumption, and the predicted reduction in contamination, and that includes the effect of that reduction on protecting human health and the likelihood of reducing beach warnings. And the study recommendation was that we undertake additional source control, including investigation of sewer leaks. Not that we have found any sewer leaks in this watershed, but continue to look for them. One of the sites I mentioned that had the really high indicator bacteria was likely due to a malfunction and a diversion that we have put in our city annex yard. So that's repair is ongoing. Do more catch basin maintenance, cleaning out, and diversion of well water. The well water is not contaminated itself, but that just would reduce our total flow, which could make the design flow and our project cost less. So the main wells that contribute to the Laguna Channel will be diverted to a underground drinking water treatment facility soon. The study also recommended additional testing and the installation of a treatment facility, ultraviolet disinfection, and it reviewed other disinfection, but recommends UV disinfection at the pump station. So that's an existing facility. There's room there for the scale that we would need, and the system is already pumped around. It's so different than our other creeks from Arroyo Burro and Mission. It's already going around and being mashed and pumped, and so this would be a suitable location to do disinfection. The additional testing, we went back to council and did an amendment to the contract to UCSB, and they have been testing this month, and we'll get the results soon. They're continuing to test with the DNA techniques and the traditional indicator bacteria. We're going upstream of Ortega Park, up storm drain network of Ortega Park, and cutting into a couple different branches, trying to see where the main load of contamination is coming from. We found out why the site we were testing was dry. And then we also found out in reviewing the watershed map that a lot of the pipes take flow from north of Ortega Park in that area and bring it underground below the main watershed, and then it discharges out in front of the Fest Parker on the beach there. And then there's another drain that takes water from kind of the mid-commercial State Street area and brings it below the lower watershed and discharges it into the lagoon below the pump station. So if we're testing those, if those end up with consistent flow and consistent contamination, we would consider trying to divert them to any treatment project that we built. The one that comes into the lagoon, that would be very simple geometrically to do. The other one would be a lot harder, but we'll just look at the results and decide what to do once we get them. And the next steps will be to review these results and then begin preliminary design and environmental review. And once we have environmental review in hand, then we can go and apply for additional funding from the Clean Beaches Initiative, Prop 84, for final design and construction. And that's what I have, and I'll open it to discussion and questions.
Thank you, Jill. Excellent, concise report. Are there any questions for Dr. Murray on her report? Let's start with Daniel at that side.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Murray. 4 questions. I think like 3 of these, just very simple, almost yes or no clarifications. Try to be very brief. I think I read in the report that the amount of water leaving the lagoon is less than the amount that is entering it. You think that's just an anomaly due to sampling, or might there be some communication with groundwater going on in a negative aspect as far as losing?
For clarification, it was the water. If we measure the flow coming into the lagoon, so coming into the pump station, so that's a manual flow measurement. That is a lot higher than if we sum up the flow measured by the automated flow gauges upstream. Actually, if we take the manual measurement from right where it comes out at the freeway. So that's a manual measurement. We've done it probably 7 times. If we take that measurement, it's higher than what when we sum our automated measurements.
Is that number substantially higher than that which could be lost due to evapotranspiration of all the aquatic plants and the like?
Well, between those 2 points, it's just storm drain. Mm-hmm. Right?
Okay.
So we don't know the answer, and some of it is certainly measurement error on with both techniques. And
just wondering if something fishy was going on hydrologically there.
The only thing that I could think of, and we've talked about it with the consultant, groundwater might be pulled. There's sumps underneath the freeway, and that's the zone that we have the loss. So maybe pulled towards some of those sumps that discharge either at certain times or that would be the wrong. Or pull it even down towards Mission. So I don't have the answer to that question. It's unresolved.
That's fine. Thanks.
Yeah.
Question regarding the tide gates, just so I can understand a little bit more how they operate. If the tide gates were removed, or let's just say left open during, not super high storm events, but normal median high tides, how far up would the ocean water go? Would it make it to the freeway and above and beyond, or not even that far?
I don't have the answer to that. There was a study done for the Public Works Department on to redo the pumps, and some of that information might be in there.
Okay, because just the reason I was wondering about that is obviously if areas north of the freeway are below sea level, then that is obviously not a good management decision to leave tide gates open. But I was wondering, just a question, not necessarily need to answer right now, but if there was tidal influence through the lagoon, to what extent might the salt water actually reduce the amount of indicator bacteria and human bacteria and so on and so forth. Make it sort of a less hospitable environment for the bacteria to culture and grow and the like. I don't know.
It's interesting to think about. It wouldn't, even if it killed off the indicator bacteria, or even if it killed off the bacterial signs of human waste, it wouldn't necessarily kill off the viruses that could potentially cause illness. So it might reduce the appearance of a problem, but might not necessarily reduce that actual risk. And then ecologically, I'm not the person to talk to about what the effects of pushing salt water up through an area where we've seen turtles and would be. I don't think north of the freeway is below sea level.
Okay. And then the proposed treatment, or the treatment that would go in, I think I saw in Mr. Troutwine's article, he wrote something about on the upstream end, but as I understand it, it's on the downstream end, or would be on the downstream on the outfall end, correct?
The proposed location is on the outfall end, mostly because that's where the creek is already so disrupted, and to avoid doing that twice, and also because looking at the results with a little bit more resolution than we've talked about here, it looks like there is some input, and then we have seen there are encampments there along the channel. So we've put in the fence. I'm sure that's reduced.
It makes a lot of sense. And the last quick question is, why is well water ending up in the storm drain? City well water?
It hasn't been high enough quality for drinking water.
Okay.
So it
then-
hasn't been contaminated enough to put into sewer. So
Great. Thanks.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Mr. Jordan?
Chair, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of quick questions and a couple of comments. And I think you just answered it. The fencing we did on Yananoli, that's on directly above the outfall as you work your way up, right? That's a good. And then have we done any resulting testing on that since we put that fencing in to see if there's any improvement?
the additional testing that UCSB is doing right now does include a site below that. So it wasn't designed to test the fence, and I don't think there would be enough samples to do a before and after statistical test. But we might have some additional information.
Okay. And then just a couple.
I'll just say one additional thing, just on visual observation there. It used to be that you could walk, this is just downstream of 101, and it used to be that you could walk down under the bridge on an Ollie Street on any given day and find evidence of human waste in the water or next to the water, as well as lots of trash, evidence of encampments, things like that. And since the fence has gone up in that area, we haven't seen any instance of that. There is still some trash. Often it's coming down through the pipe under the freeway. Some is being thrown over the top, but no evidence of those other things.
Okay, thanks. Then just a couple of comments I'd have, again, back to Mr. Trotwine's letter from Environmental Defense Center. Everything in that letter I philosophically agree with, that it, of course, is ideal to not be doing end-of-pipe treatments, but the way you've described this also sounds to me like a Swiss cheese project going back upstream, that there's multiple entries and you're not sure where they go. And in addition to that, coupled with the fact that I'm not confident that you can match the emphasis of the known fix of a end pipe treatment with a enforcement consequence once you do find out where the source point is upstream. So my comment would be that when we're in a position to enforce what we might find upstream, that's really the case to make for continuing to spend money and go search when this is a known fix right now. The other comment I would make is that we've talked about this site before, especially down on the beach, and it's very unsightly. I mean, that's a polite word for what it really looks like. And I would hope that any work that we're doing down there that costs a couple $100,000 or $250,000 will take into account the long-term vision for making that making it look a lot better and fit into our plan to get that concrete out of there, put something else in, and it won't be we spend $250,000 and then we have some money 5 years from now and we have to rip it out to redo our long-term vision. So, and anything we can do in that regard to join those two processes up. That's just an eyesore on the beach that needs to be fixed eventually. Thanks.
Mr. Weber, any questions or comments?
Yeah, just one quick question. Thanks, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Murray. I know you said it wasn't part of the scope of this project to determine physical sources of HPM, but I'm wondering if it's possible for you to speculate as to where some of these signals might come from.
One that's been suggested is dumping by recreational vehicles that are parked along. So we did do one morning of complete reconnaissance of the entire lower watershed. We checked every catch basin or drop inlet in the area where RVs were parked, and there were no signs of any dumping. So we didn't do that every day, but since we have found the material, every day we've tested, that at least partially rules that out, not entirely. I don't know if there are some areas where we have some diffuse leak from a sewer line that's running above a storm drain line, especially during dry weather when the water table might be below. That's the kind of thing we're investigating with our other Clean Beaches Initiative grant. And we know that there are probably a few laterals that have been hooked up incorrectly. There's recently just found one that doesn't go into Laguna Channel, and then last year found another one. So they're probably there at a very low percentage rate. And we are looking into we are looking into some additional methods for gathering more information, but I don't have any specific locations for this watershed.
Mr. Schluter, any questions or comments?
Yes, would you go back to
The question was whether the dark red circles just downstream from the 101 there were the areas where we installed a fence around the channel, and the answer is yes, those are in the areas. However, all of the sampling was done before the fence went in. Yes, the sampling was done last, I believe, July through September of 2008. I think the fence was installed in October 2008. So we actually were looking at gathering information before that went in. Now we're going to have some information from after the fact. However, it is a creek, so the water's moving through there from upstream.
I understand, but I did want to understand the location and the timing relative to the sampling that you had done. And my last question, or one of my next questions is, did you measure the salinity of this continuous runoff?
Yes, we did measure the salinity, and I cannot recall the results off the top of my head. They were not atypical for storm drains.
They were not.
They were not unusual for storm drains in our area. What are you thinking?
I'm not sure I'm thinking.
Okay. There was a case.
I'm curious that if the well water is contaminated water, are we repumping salt water back up into the system? That's what I'm thinking about. I mean, you say it's not good enough for consumables, but it's not so bad. It goes to treatment. Is it because the salinity is sufficiently high? There's indications that we're pumping seawater.
No,
or some part of it.
It's because of hydrogen sulfide. So that will, when the wells go online into this treatment plant, it'll remove the hydrogen sulfide.
All right.
And there's probably more to it than that. That's not my forte.
All right. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Murray. Excellent report. I'd like to let the people in the audience know that Brian Troutwine, the founder of the Greater Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council and now a staff with a local nonprofit group, did in fact submit by email a letter to Mr. Benson and through him to the committee expressing interest in the study on the Laguna Channel and stating his general reluctance to use UV treatment as an easy solution, but recognizing that the special nature of Laguna Creek being mostly urban, being mostly already piped and channelized, and being clearly polluted, that this might be a situation where the UV might be tried. And this is a position that Mr. Trotwine has articulated before the committee over the years. I'd also like to note that as one of the stakeholder members for the Prop 84 local committee, and I've seen Mr. Benson and Mr. Conti there at different meetings. I know they're moving forward with a suite of projects to try to qualify, but given the severity of the state's budget and economic crisis, those funds seem to be frozen at the moment. On the other hand, if we don't apply correctly and in a timely fashion, when the funds are someday unfrozen, we won't be eligible to get them. So I want the people at home to know that the efforts to bring some of the bond money to bear on qualifying local projects is going forward, even though the state is in a tough place. So I want to thank you, but I also want to see if our liaison from the Parks and Recreation Commission, Mr. Hockman, has any questions or comments on the study. Daniel?
Thank you, Chair. I do. Thank you for the report. My first question is about the feasibility analysis that was done by Geosyntec. They did it. One of the research points or question points was about the possible reduction or impact on beach warnings in the future, and I'm wondering if we're successful in any way at changing the methodology for determining what a beach warning is. Has that been considered in this cost-benefit analysis?
Okay. Using the methods that we use now,
Right.
We don't know exactly what the impact on the number of beach warnings would be, and it could have not as much of an effect as we would want, because what we've learned from our UV project and what, in particular, Moonlight Beach and Encinitas has learned from their UV project, that the numbers go back up, and they seem to be growing in the environment. There's not additional waste sources in some of these areas pretty quickly downstream.
Mm-hmm.
So
the question I had is
that's the standard methods.
That's the standard method now.
Now, I could talk for days about this, so stop me.
Okay.
The EPA is committed to revising criteria by October 2012. So releasing criteria for public comment well before that.
Right.
They don't want to. They're under consent decree to not continue using the same techniques. It looks like they're doing some additional studies on different methods. They've funded some large epidemiology studies the results are just coming in, so we should learn a lot in the next year or two. And they're reviewing everything. They're reviewing what is the accepted risk level to swimmers, and but I will say it looks like the technique that they're going to use is a more rapid way to get at the Enterococcus.
Okay.
So it's not human-specific or anything like that.
So one of the goals of our research study with UCSB was to, in some way, possibly have an impact on testing methods in the future. You're not seeing that as part of the 2012 decision?
The method that they're using is qPCR, and that would be the method that would be approved for Enterococcus. And I shouldn't even jump out that far, because we don't know what's going to happen. And I heard the person who's in charge of this say, we're not going to make any commitments until all this data comes in.
Yeah.
And then if they approve qPCR if they approve the overall method for Enterococcus, I'm sure we'll have, it's going to make off-the-shelf lab testing for these techniques much more readily available.
But specifically, the question that I asked was relative to the cost-benefit analysis, and that beach warnings was a factor that was put into that to see which kind of implementation to do. And so was the possible change of methodology for testing included in that cost-benefit analysis?
Not explicitly.
Okay. So I'm wondering, do you anticipate that the results of that would change if you considered possible changes.
I don't expect that the recommendation would change.
Okay.
At all.
Fair enough. The UV disinfection project, is this the same project that we've seen several times in the past several years come and go before this committee?
You've seen a, when I wasn't here then, so I don't know what you actually saw, but there was a concept and review of ozone. And I think it actually did, it came up with an ozone recommendation, but also did go through ultraviolet also.
Right.
And it was thought then
I think it did.
Arroyo Burrow wasn't that?
Oh,
Well, we did it. No, we
Okay,
also
right.
at the same time were considering a project here. That seemed a lot more likely, but at that point, I believe the funding sources might have disappeared, or either that, or I'm not exact. I can't recall exactly why we didn't move forward with it at that point. But it does seem that this is the same, either the same project or a very similar project in the same location.
an explicit goal of this project was to review those findings based on what we have learned since then.
Wonderful. And then the last question I have is about the repair annex yard diversion and the issue that was discovered there. Was that issue discovered as a result of this testing, or was there some sort of ongoing process whereby we discovered the issue?
The issue was really brought forth by this process.
So that leads to my next question is, do we have any sort of ongoing maintenance process which will go about and find issues with installations that we've put in?
All of the Creeks Division installations that have been put in are maintained very actively, and like we tested our UV surf project weekly during
So this is not
operation.
one that we put in?
Not, I don't know if Creeks might have
Yeah,
funded
I think
it.
we'd had a big project at the repair yard. Maybe a different repair yard, so let me... I'll back off a little bit on this, but
Yeah, the Creeks Division installed in the annex yard a diversion system that has an overflow to the storm drain.
Correct.
And what we've discovered is that the pipe leading to the wastewater treatment plant, which is where the water's supposed to go after it gets pre-screened and then it goes into the wastewater treatment plant, it was getting clogged. We did a repair to that system. It's still getting clogged. I was just out there yesterday, and we were running some tests on it, and it's still getting clogged. We're working with several different departments within the city to address that, and we've got several different designs we're working on to make sure that gets taken care of.
Okay. I'm not so concerned with the repair because I'm confident that will happen one way or another. The question that I'm bringing up is, aside from serendipity, how are we going to continue to find issues in our system, especially in our installed systems? And I don't need an answer now, but I'm just posing the question.
I will say that's one of the things that we have learned over time. Other communities around the state are learning over time as we move forward with stormwater management and urban runoff treatment. Is that when you have some sort of manufactured filter down in the ground where you can't see it, it's difficult to maintain it, and it's difficult to ensure that it's being properly maintained to give you the results that it was designed to give you. And we definitely have developed a preference for best management practices, structural treatments, and things that are above ground and that are visible just while you're walking by. And I think as we implement those, not only on city property, but as people implement those kinds of things on private property, I think we'll be able to understand how those systems are working a lot better. It'll be very obvious to everyone.
All right, and I would also assume some sort of maintenance program for going in and doing the work to investigate every once in a while on some regular basis how our existing below ground systems are working. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That completes Dr. Murray's report on item 9A, and while she catches her breath as we move to item 9B, I know that there are going to be some people at home or at the website who are thinking that for the first time they've caught our co-workers support Liz in an error where the agenda goes from 9 to 11. So while Dr. Murray tees up 9B, I'd like to point out that originally there was going to be an item number 10, which might have been a report from staff on the effect of the fire on the different creek watersheds in the foothills, but the staff has informed us that because of the opportunity to get better data from other participating agencies, that report we'd hoped to have today, which probably would have been item number 10, has been postponed to a later meeting, which is why there's that hole on the agenda. But that being said, it does bring us to item 9B, Water Quality Monitoring and Research Program Update and Fiscal Year 2010 Research Plan, which Dr. Murray is also going to present. And please listen carefully because we're going to be looking for a committee recommendation to support the staff recommendation to forward on to the two commissions and to council. So, Dr. Murray?
Thank you. Okay. I'll just go right to the outline, and there might have been a bit of confusion. I'm going to start off presenting some results from our monitoring program from fiscal year 09 till now, some highlights, and that includes some work on wildfire and water quality effects. It'll also present a little bit of information on our toxicity testing and sediment quality testing. And then we'll move into the FY10 research plan, and I'll talk about the goals, changes from FY09, and move through some of the program elements, not all of them. So, and we've had to get up to speed on this issue. It's had so many fires recently. We've learned that potential runoff concerns after fire are sediment, metals, PAHs, which can be products of combustion, and caustic pH, the pH being very basic in the ash, and when the ash gets in the creek could lead the creek to being really high pH, and then also concerns about fire retardants and their impacts. I want to say that the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, so a large research body in Southern California, just last summer came together, and they're trying to understand kind of Southern California-wide what are some of the effects of wildfire. So there isn't really a systematic understanding in our area as of yet. We did some limited sampling after the T fire, and I want to talk about that. The T fire was really interesting because it presented a good opportunity to test a burned area versus an unburned area, because almost the entire Upper Sycamore Creek watershed was burned, and the burn area was so largely contained to that watershed. And so it rained just a week after the fire, and we tested at two sites. For our unburned was Mission Creek at Mission Canyon, and that watershed area is about the same size as the Upper Sycamore Creek watershed area, and we tested there near 5 Points at APS. And then we compared the results from those two sites, burned versus unburned, and then we also collected samples from our downstream sampling site on Sycamore Creek, and then used those to look at pre-fire versus post-fire based on our previous years of storm sampling. And we sampled for the burned versus unburned. We took several samples at each site during the first tenth of an inch of rainfall, and then the mandatory evacuation order was called for the Sycamore site, so we stopped sampling. So it is limited. It's just a very limited data set, and we found that sediment, arsenic, copper, and nickel were higher at our burned site. Even so, the levels were well below criteria established to predict any problems for aquatic organisms. And we didn't detect at either site any PAHs, lead, cadmium, chromium, selenium, or silver. The burned site, I'm pretty sure we were just getting runoff from streets at that point and local ash runoff. The water smelled really sooty, but it didn't have a high sediment load. We weren't collecting water that was brought down from the upper watershed at that point. And then we moved downstream later in the storm. After about a half of an inch of rainfall, we sampled near the 101 on Sycamore Creek, and we didn't find anything jumping out as being much higher compared to previous years of sampling. But with visual observation, I don't know if you've, well, people can go down there now, and just there was extensive sediment deposition in the lower watershed, lower creek, and so areas that were, cobble habitat are now soft bottom. And then we've gotten calls and questions about the effects of fire retardant. Locally, being sprayed from the tankers was Phos-Chek, which is a trade brand, and then they have a lot of different formulations. And the potential concerns would be toxicity, like acute toxicity if the material is sprayed right in a water body during the fire, and then also runoff later, and especially nutrient loads, because Phos-Chek, it's largely phosphorus, and that can cause nutrient loading problems and eutrophication, or could. The product literature, that material safety data sheet that comes with the Phos-Chek lists the toxicity tests that have been done and ranked, and they're ranked as practically non-toxic. And we've looked into testing it in runoff, and it's just really not easy to do. There isn't all the formulations are proprietary, and I don't think there would even be a specific compound that we could go test for that would show that we have fire retardant in runoff. There are some USGS scientists that are looking into ways to use optical properties of dissolved organic material. It's exploratory at this point, and nothing that we could do as a city. And then trying to separate nutrient load from fire retardant versus nutrient load from increased sediment runoff after the fire. It would be downright impossible, I believe. But we will sample for the Hestia fire and its effects. We now can use our Mission Creek at Mission Canyon site. That's now our post-fire site. And unfortunately, we don't really have an unburned upper watershed site anymore within the city. And we'll test for the same things: pHs, metals, sediment, pH, toxicity, and we'll also be testing lower at Mission Creek at Montecito Street, like we always do during our first flush storms. So we'll have, even if there's an evacuation order called, which there probably will be, if there's any substantial rain, we'll have our downstream samples. So moving on to toxicity testing, this was one of the things that we commented on in our letter to the board about the 303D listings is toxicity. We started toxicity testing 2.5 years ago, partly as just learning more about different tiers of ways to understand water quality. We can test for individual chemicals, and we can compare those to criteria, but toxicity testing is a way to look at the impact of all of the chemicals combined. And we had also, I think, some of the committee members suggested it, and then we had aware of this listing for Mission Creek for toxicity, unknown toxicity. So we took on a toxicity testing program. We've collected about 30 samples. Each of the samples are sent to an outside lab, and fathead minnows are exposed to the water for 5 days, and then the percent survival of the number of fish is recorded. And of all of our samples, they've all been mostly above 95% survival, all above 90% survival, which is considered a cutoff, except for one sample during at Laguna Channel. It was the earliest we'd ever caught the first flush runoff. It was several minutes after it started raining, and that sample had 55% survival, I believe. So we don't have a large scale, using kind of the same statistical methods the regional board uses, but kind of applying it, to our entire area. We don't have a large scale toxicity problem on our creeks, particularly in dry weather. And we'll continue testing in storms and look into more storm drain samples too. We've also 2 years ago started testing for sediment quality. Testing sediment is another way to look at kind of the cumulative impacts of water quality, because a lot of the compounds in the water can adsorb onto sediment grains and accumulate there. And so you can get higher concentrations of pollutants in sediments, but it's also complicated because those aren't necessarily available to organisms and therefore causing problems to organisms. And there hasn't really been a good set of standards for comparing chemistry results in sediment, but the state is now undergoing a process to come up with some sediment guidelines. And so that's another reason why we started this effort. So we've collected them at the outfall sites, so the lagoon sites for our main creeks, and we've tried to find the areas for collection where you have the most deposition of sediment, not areas that are being flushed clean every year. We've tested the sediments for metals, pesticides, herbicides, pHs, PCBs, and toxicity, and then scored them on all of the individual chemical pollutants and gone through a really extensive algorithm that the state draft guidelines suggest to understand the overall impact of the potential for all of the chemicals to cause any problems with the sediment organisms. And so very, very brief summary. Most of the compounds for most of the sites are below the criteria for individual chemicals. We had the most exceedances at Laguna, and we didn't see toxicity in any of our sediments both years. And then when we go through this algorithm, it reports a score of the potential for chemically mediated effects. So it takes the chemistry and the toxicity and says, what is the potential that this site has a problem with chemical-related effects on sediment organisms? And it's ranked as minimal, low, moderate, or severe. And Sycamore Creek, the Bird Refuge sediment, Mission Creek sediment, Arroyo Burro sediment, all were reported at a minimal level of potential problem. And Laguna Channel, with it, had a few more exceedances, was reported at a low level of potential. So I'm going to move on to our FY10 research plan, and you have a copy of the plan. And the goals are understanding the levels of microbial contamination and chemical pollution, and then understanding their impacts. So evaluating them for their potential to cause human health risk or problem with recreation or particular aquatic organisms or steelhead that are spawning. There are different ways to evaluate the results based on what our questions are. Evaluate the effectiveness of our projects, identify sources of pollution, and that is types. That means types of pollution, like the human waste, or locations where it's getting into storm drains and creeks, and then evaluate long-term trends. We changed our program a lot 2 years ago, and things have been fairly steady. For changes from last year, we've expanded the goals. Kind of as we've changed the actual program, we've realized that our actual goals have changed. We've added a beach water quality element this year. We've expanded the source tracking element and added some specific concerns, excuse me, eutrophication, fire effects, and the potential for pHs and foam to be running off of streets and parking lots that have been slurry sealed. So I'll go through most of the program elements, those that mostly involve the laboratory testing and the site testing. I'm not going to go through bioassessment and creek walks, but they're in your handout. So for watershed assessment, we're asking the questions, what are the long-term trends? And that really seems to be one of the most common questions we get from the public. But looking at long-term trends, we're still seeing a lot of impact on climate and variability, but we'll still be continuing to collect that data. Looking at sediment quality, we're going to do this at least one more year. Look at the impacts of eutrophication on our creeks, and so that's nutrient loading and algae blooms and dissolved oxygen problems. For storm monitoring, our questions are, what are the pollutants of concern? We've ruled out a lot and in the last couple of years, but then there are others that are emerging. We're learning more about the pyrethroid, pesticides, and as I mentioned, pHs, look into pHs more. Excuse me. We'll be looking at the impacts of the Hesesita fire, looking at sources, routes, and loads of pollutants during storms. So not just measuring concentrations, but trying to deduce from patterns of when materials getting into the creek, where they might be coming from. And that the focus there is on Arroyo Burro because that's where we have our flow gauge and our auto sampler installed. Some of our projects are stormwater projects, and so we'll be testing those during storms. For project assessment, we're looking at, do projects result in improved water quality? We're collecting baseline data for future projects. We're looking at mechanisms of project success or project function. And as Member Hockman referred to, we're looking at whether projects are functioning correctly. And the beach water quality element, which has been added, we are looking at a lot of these are some of these are questions. we're looking at how creeks and storm drains relate to beach water quality in mornings. How do other factors such as kelp and tides and growth on sediment relate to beach warnings? What are the causes of persistent beach warnings? And what is the risk to human health from recreation in creeks and beaches? And we'll be doing some indicator bacteria testing for this, but we have so much information now, and so a large part of this effort will be statistical tests and modeling, especially based on the epidemiology studies that come out. We'll learn a lot more about understanding our results. And then our source tracking, a lot of this is tackled through our ongoing grants, but we're looking at which subdrainages and drains contribute the most pollution, and we were able to hone in on some specific areas based on our last 2 years of work, so we'll kind of narrow our geographic focus on that a bit, trying to find where sources of human waste are coming into drains and creeks, looking at whether rotting plant material and sediment contribute to high indicator bacteria levels in storm drains, what are the impacts of reservoir flushing, and because those at times get discharged right into the creeks, and are we seeing new hotspots emerging? So most of these we're tackling with water quality tests. Some of them we do in-house at El Estero, some of them, and we send others out to the outsourced labs. The total cost for the lab tests is almost $65,000, and it's consistent with years past. Our next step is to carry out the research plan, continue our quarterly and annual reporting, and we'll come back in November to present the annual report from FY09 and update you on our source tracking grant. And with that, I'll take questions.
Before I ask for questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Murray and the entire staff. I know, and I think Mr. Hockman may point out, that one of the things that the visitor serving industry that helps fund Measure B has asked for repeatedly is that the programs be science and fact-based, so that they're confident that public agencies aren't just going out spending money because it's there. And I think the breadth and the thought that your staff team have put behind this proposal is really to gather really strong, reliable data, so that as Mr. Benson and his successors go and meet with our funding source on a regular basis, there can be a high level of confidence that the projects we're putting forward really are based on sound science and best areas of facts. But that's just my editorial. I want to see if there are any questions or comments from other committee members after that excellent report. Since we started with Mr. Wilson last time, why don't we start with Mr. Hockman and Mr. Schluter first?
I enjoyed the report, and I actually don't have any comments or questions.
My only question is, on your last slide, actually, how does the source tracking grant report in 2010 mesh with our budgeting cycle so that whatever comes out, we can act and react accordingly? Yes, that's mostly meant for...
Thank you, Mr. Schluter. In our capital budget, we do have some funding available for a bacterial reduction program. It's not a significant amount, but it was put there in the capital budget to develop design to begin acting on a project that would come from that grant. So we have some funding to begin design. We would be looking at our capital budget for the following year to add funds to that.
In the 210 budget? Is that what you're...
Well, in November of 2010, we're actually in the FY11
that's
budget.
Right, yeah.
And we also have the ability, if something came out and was immediate and needed immediate attention, to use some of the reserve fund that the committee has recommended maintaining and the division has maintained, and transferring some funds from that reserve fund to move forward with the project if we needed to.
Yeah, Mr. Weber, any questions or comments?
Yeah, Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Murray. I had a couple of questions. The first is on the toxicity testing. And I know we had a discussion about this probably over a year ago, but can you remind the committee, were the toxicity tests, did they have duplication, or was it one sample per location?
We collect one sample per location, and then they run it in, they have 5 control and 3 treatment.
Okay, so we have one water source, basically, and then they...
Yes,
Okay.
in some cases it's a composite sample that we send off to them. In other cases it's not. For example, if we're wanting to get the earliest first flush, we're not going to, if we're looking for the worst case scenario, we're not going to dilute it with runoff that's coming later in the storm.
And
Sorry,
can you remind me, does the report say that you're not recommending continuing with the toxicity testing?
We're not recommending continuation during dry weather.
Okay.
And we will continue during our storm sampling, first flush sampling in creeks, and some storm drain sampling.
And so I know that you are pursuing getting us removed from the 303D list for toxicity. Does this, what we've done so far, does that seem consistent with what they require in order to provide evidence of
Yeah.
removal?
Do you want to hear details? Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
So that Mission Creek was listed based on an anecdote of a fish kill, and I don't know how many fish, and it was in the 90s, and there were no samples collected, no data collected. So you could never list a creek like that now. That wouldn't be allowed. To delist it, there has to be at least 28 samples collected, and no more than 2 can exceed toxicity. The way they define their criteria for the regional board is no more than 20% different from the control. So if your control is 100% survival, you can't have less than 80% survival. So for Mission Creek, we have not collected 28 samples. The regional board, CCAMP, their sampling arm, has collected some samples. If you combine theirs with ours, I think we're close to 20. We don't have enough for the full 28. They've collected some more recently that's not included in the listing analysis. I don't think any samples have exceeded. So based on one of the available factors for delisting is no continued observation of a problem, and so there hasn't been observation of a problem that we're aware of, and we have almost enough to meet the statistical test that would allow 2 exceedances, and we have 0 exceedances. So we're asking them to delist it now, and part of the reason is we don't think there is a toxicity problem, and we want to prioritize our efforts and not continue. The tests are really expensive, and not continue testing when we don't feel there's a problem.
Good. Well, that's good to hear.
Okay.
Could you jump to the slide labeled storm monitoring? It's just a clarification question, and maybe you covered it and I was asleep, but the pH is /foam. I'm curious if you could, as the pH is related to the foam?
There is in some areas it has been shown that slurry sealing of streets and parking lots leads to pH discharge and pretty high levels of pHs. And for example, the city of Austin has created an ordinance that you have to use the kind of seal coat that has less pHs, asphalt versus coal. We don't believe that we think in most areas they're probably using the asphalt-based one here. But we also have we have a hypothesis based on visual observation that some of the foam that we see on the streets is also coming from the slurry sealing. And we have this, other researchers in City of Austin and USGS have some video of when they've gone and simulated rainstorms on the newly sealed area, the foam runs off. And if you start driving around, you start thinking you're only seeing foam on the newly sealed streets, then you see it everywhere. But so we're going to be doing some testing in the summer, simulating rainfall. Then just means like with a bucket or hose, testing for pHs. And because we do have some pHs in the sediments, so curious if that could be coming from it. And then you can't test for foam. You can test for surfactants, which is what we do. But the surfactants, the normal test that we have isn't the one that it wouldn't cover the surfactants that are used in the emulsifier for slurry sealing. So we're going to look into getting labs to develop a different testing method.
Great. And then that's my questions. I had one comment for your the post-fire sampling you've done and the ones that you're going to be undertaking, that's really great to hear. And I want to encourage you and your staff, if you haven't already considered this, to consider publishing your results depending on what they end up. You had said earlier that this is a big mystery. What do these watersheds look like after a fire, and what are potential impacts to the ocean? And I think if you were successful publishing it, that's great for you guys. But it's also having scientifically rigorous published literature lends a lot of credibility to the work that the city staff is doing, and would be good for outreach purposes as well.
Does it sound like a potential partnership with some graduate school of environmental science policy and management? So some advanced graduate student might use this as a dissertation topic?
It does sound like that. Yeah. That wasn't where I was going, but that's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
I, of course, love to publish results. We've talked in the past that really it's not appropriate Measure B spending it takes a lot of time to get something published. But whenever we hire consultants to do work, I strongly encourage that they publish. And then our partnership with UCSB has led to publications. I don't think that for Hesitate to Fire, with the budget that we've allocated thus far, I don't think we're going to come up with necessarily results that would constitute a publication. But I have been in touch with SCORP, and they might be interested in bringing more funds or more staff even to the sampling effort. And when I talked to SCORP after the T-Fire, they put me in touch with USGS scientists in Denver, Jeff Plumley, and so he does a bunch of ash testing. So they collect the ash and see what and the sediment that's been charred, but what's in it, and then they do a test where they simulate runoff and what comes out of it. And so we sent them some material from the T-Fire, and we've got results on that. And then based on that partnership, they sent out a whole team of their staff to sample extensively and more rigorously after the Hesitate Fire. So that will be published.
Okay.
So we're helping.
Good.
On fire? I don't know.
Anyway, I wanted to see if Mr. Jordan or Mr. Wilson had any questions or comments before we entertain a motion to consider forwarding the staff recommendations to the council for consideration and action. So,
thank you, Mr. Chair. Sure. Mr. Cameron, I guess my first question is, the action we're being asked today is kind of the big scope of the picture, but is the dollar amount within the budget? Is this a budgeted amount that we're not approving in excess of what was already budgeted?
That's correct. It's in the recommended budgeted amount that's been recommended to council, which this committee recommended, and the Park and Recreation Commission also recommended.
Okay, and then, as always, I'm happy to throw myself out there and admit my ignorance, so I appreciate Chair Moldaver's editorial on science and fact-based collection, and I appreciate Mr. Weber's enthusiasm on fire studies. But in particular, are we not just testing for testing's sake? Because I don't quite know what the consequence of using that testing is once you have runoff ash or ash that came down, went into a storm drain and went into a creek. You're obviously not going to go collect it. You're obviously not going to mitigate it. So are we not just testing for testing's sake for research?
I'll start and maybe Cameron will follow up, but we're not doing extensive testing. So it's not a huge part of our sampling budget as a part of the answer. And the second is, if we did have a problem, which we might see by a fish kill, or if we high sediment loads, and we want to know, is that coming, or is there something that we can see from the fire effects from our fire testing that could lead to that? That's
I agree,
one reason.
but it's exactly what I'm saying, because there's really not, a fire is out of control, a fire burns, the consequence is ash all over the city into the storm drains down the watersheds. And so I guess my point is, even if you're able to quantify what you would expect from that, there's really no remedy after the fact. It's just a thing a piece of Mother Nature we live with eventually.
But we could attribute it to the fire
We
rather
could
than trying
attribute
to
it.
attribute an effect to some other process that we could chase around and spend additional
Okay.
funds on.
All right. That's, really the only thing that jumps out at me is I'm, when we get into science and fact-based stuff, I start to really struggle to say, is the emphasis on that equal to the emphasis of the fix that it leads to? And in this particular case, I guess I'm not convinced or just going to remain ignorant. So,
Well-
and that's really my comment.
Mr. Jordan, as Dr. Murray pointed out, it's a very small portion of the overall water quality plan for next year. The sampling we did after the T fire was a very small amount of sampling. We are charged with monitoring and having knowledge of the surface water quality in Santa Barbara. That's part of it, both for human health as well as the aquatic health. But one of the things, as we started out this meeting, was talking about the regional board's regulatory processes, and they're extensive under the Federal Clean Water Act, and the costs for compliance with those regulations for the city of Santa Barbara can be considerable. And if those regulations are being based on kind of outlier years that are associated with some unusual event like a wildfire in this area, we want to know about that, because that becomes part of our discussion with the regulators as to what are our priorities here and what's appropriate going forward. And if we see those kinds of impacts going away over a couple of years after the fire and after the vegetation's growing back and so forth, then coming up with a new regulatory structure for say metals or for PAHs wouldn't be appropriate, wouldn't be advisable, and would be very expensive for the city going forward.
I appreciate that explanation. I think that's a part of the explanation that needs to take place when we add, we take out, we revise, because as you know, there's people who are much more ignorant even than me who just equate this type of activity with science for no reason. And that makes perfect sense to me, and I'm glad to hear that explanation. And I think when we, especially in this economic times, when you hear you're going to do something different, or you can't really equate you can't build a nexus between why you're doing it and what you're going to do when you find out what the end result is. I think that type of explanation goes a long way towards resolving that issue. Thanks.
Mr. Wilson, any questions or comments?
Yes, thank you, Chair. With all due respect to Committee Member Jordan, I think this is actually a very judicious use of the research money. Sounds a little bit like triage, where spend a little to hopefully save a tremendous amount of money and effort later down the road for everyone's benefit. Regarding budget, there was a figure of about $67,000 for lab costs, something like that. I was just wondering what the associated staff costs for that were as well. Just sort of ballpark.
Well, I couldn't separate it to just doing these particular tests listed associated with the collecting the samples for the lab cost. The field monitor does almost all the sample collection, creek walks, equipment maintenance, and then some reporting, and then I'm doing a lot of reporting and grant work. So it'd be hard to separate. I don't know if you're asking to separate it
So
just for the
maybe
sample collection.
Try to clarify my question.
Well, I understand. I think I understand the question. I don't have that number for you tonight. When we do our annual reports, we actually try to ferret out as best we can what that number was for the past fiscal year, and so we've done that in past annual reports. I just don't have it.
So
right now.
maybe my question is, I'm trying to understand exactly what we're going to vote on here, and this is essentially to support staff's recommendation for an additional use of some funds, or no, just to continue with the program as proposed.
What
So
the
last comment, I got confused on them.
The recommendation for action was to concur with staff's recommendation to implement the proposed research plan for FY10, which was attached to the staff report, and I think you guys all have copies of that. the amount of funding is not really part of this plan. It's included in the budget, and that the amount, for example, for lab cost was included for the for FY10 budget. I think we had 70,000 was the number that we had in there because we were still working out the details of this plan. So at 60, I think it came out at 65. There's a little bit of room in there.
Okay, so this 64,910 is still in line with everything. Okay, there were some questions among the committee that kind of, I guess, confused me as to what really was going on here. And just one other clarification question. I think you mentioned pyrethrins at one point. Where's City Creek staff's position on pesticides? Thought maybe a year or 2 years ago there was not much, pesticides weren't really identified, and so research was steered away from that. I was just wondering what the current knowledge base on pesticides is.
We have not found any problem with pesticides in our water quality sampling, and zero detections in herbicide and pesticides in sediments, with the exception of bifenthrin, which is a pyrethroid in the bird refuge. So, but because we found it and it's close to the only threshold available for that compound, it's something we're going to start paying more attention to. But we've sampled for pyrethroids. You don't ever find, I mean, it's not recommended to test them in the water. It's recommended to test them in sediment. And so we have at our main outfall sites and only found it at the bird refuge.
Thank you. And then just...
Yeah, and we're continuing that.
And then
Yeah.
just an associated is through the last 3 years or so of the discussion of pesticides, just wondering if there was any communication or collaboration with the Agricultural Commissioner's Office, and or was there like a UCSB researcher intern a couple years ago, or a project that maybe did some kind of a evaluation of actually how much pesticides are documented to be used within the city limits and within the area that affect the watersheds?
There was an intern who worked on that, and it wasn't related to the water quality sampling. I don't know the results of that. I have started to look into the pyrethroids, and I haven't found those weren't. I don't know if those were included in that report. But even though we have found X amount being used in the city limits, we're not finding them in runoff regularly.
Boy, I hope that really is true. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson, I think Mr. Jordan has a motion to put on the table.
Yeah, so I'd like to move that we concur with the staff recommendation to implement the proposed research plan for fiscal year 2010.
Is there a second? Second. All right, seconded by Mr. Weber. Moved and seconded to concur with the staff recommendation for the research plan for fiscal year 2010. Are there any final questions or comments for staff before we call the question? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Are there any opposed? Are there any abstentions? Please let the record note that the motion is carried unanimously. That brings us to item number 11, one of the important parts of every meeting. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
It's moved by George and seconded by Daniel. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All right, we are adjourned at 6.